Hi, everyone. I'm Kathy Fisher, and I'm the department head at the Frederick Porter Griffin Center for Local History and Genealogy here at the Harrison County Public Library. I'm thrilled to finally get this going, and I'd like to welcome you to this virtual program from Amanda to Zerelda, Hoosier suffragist who raised a ruckus. After some fits and starts and delays, a little pandemic, and maybe some technical hiccups, we finally got this pulled things together, and let's take two. We're gonna try something a little new with this Facebook Live programming, even if it's not quite on time. This presentation was all made possible through a grant from the Indiana Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, Indiana Humanities, the Lilly Endowment Incorporated, and Hillenbrand Incorporated. Here with me live, through her computer in Terre Haute anyway, to speak and probably sing about some ruckus raising Hoosier women. I'll welcome our special guest speaker, Marcia Miller. And a little bit about her. Marcia has taught more than 4,800 information literacy sessions at Indiana State University. Go Sycamores. And she coordinates the university's library's social media. She earned degrees in history and library science from Central Michigan University and the University of Michigan, respectively. Since 2012, as a member of the League of Women Voters of Vigo County, she has served on the steering committee for the annual celebration of Women's Equality Day, which happens in August, so mark your calendars. Marcia currently serves as the Indiana president of the American Association of University Women. And perhaps my personal favorite, she also plays the clarinet and is known as the Purple Librarian. Now, one more quick thing before I turn things over. I just want to mention that any of you out there have questions, you can try to type them into the comments of the video, and we'll try to monitor it and see if we can get that worked out to pass them along to Marcia for her to answer towards the end of her presentation. And if you could actually post where you're watching from, how many people you've got with you and that kind of thing, that would help us, kind of keep track of the attendance and help us out. Okay, I think that's about covered all the announcements and intros. So now I'll pass things over to you, Marcia. So welcome, welcome.
Thank you very much. You can hear me, I think, so we're ready to go. Thank you. It's the right of every woman to mark out her path in life, and to be a saint or soldier or a true and loving wife, to fill the soul with gladness and recall the world from strife as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, as she goes marching on. It's her right to serve the nation in its every hour of need, her right to sit in judgment on her country's faith and creed, and show the world her courage by some high heroic deed as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, as she goes marching on. It's her right to train the children in the home and in the school, to help in framing statutes and determine who shall rule, and like man to cast her ballot for a statesman or a fool as she goes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, as she goes marching on. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today virtually. I am Marcia Miller speaking to you from Terre Haute, and I wanted to mention the reason I started with the songs is because of the Women's March that we were doing every year, and I said if we're going to march we have to sing, you can't just march. Excuse me just a minute. So I started collecting the songs. That is a song of the suffragists. There were songs, there were poems, there were plays, there were operas, all having to do with the march towards what we did not know was going to turn into a decades-long battle for the suffrage. So I have a presentation I'll start with in just a moment, a PowerPoint, and there will be a song break. And even though you may not be singing in a room together with other people, I expect you to sing. There will be PowerPoint slides, and you will know the tune. To just put this in perspective, while I am talking primarily about Hoosier women today, one of the reasons that men felt that women should not be involved in politics was it was just too hard, too dangerous, too messy, and they just wouldn't be able to handle it. So naturally, in order to get suffrage passed, they spent quite a bit of time in the political arena. And Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the final president of the North American Women's Suffrage Association, first president, a creator of the League of Women Voters, came up with this list. In order to get suffrage passed, more than 50 referendums among the states, 480 campaigns to get legislators to submit suffrage amendments to voters, 47 campaigns to get constitutional conventions to write women's suffrage into state constitutions, 277 campaigns to get state party conventions to include women's suffrage planks, 30 campaigns to get presidential party campaigns to include women's suffrage planks in party platforms, and 19 campaigns in 19 successive Congresses. So that is what took us to get here. And then, of course, things happened after that. But I am going to go ahead and share my screen now and begin the actual presentation. You've already heard the name of it from Amanda to Zerelda. Always fun to be able to do something with names on an occasion like this. And I'm very honored to be one of the 11 Speakers Bureau speakers, starting in 2020 and then continuing unexpectedly into 2021 from Indiana Humanities and the other sponsors of the Indiana suffrage celebration. So what is the big deal, right? This is the amendment. This is what the fuss was all about. This is all it said. The rights of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. One of the strong beliefs in the 19th century and before is that, and this came up in a lot of the songs, that there were women's spheres and men's spheres. Women's spheres, business, politics, and generally being out in the public area. Women, of course, needed to stay home, be good wives, and good mothers. And as the suffrage campaign continued over the decades, some of the images got pretty rampant and negative. And so, for example, you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the wonderful, loving mother on the left, and then the only alternative, if she dared to want to vote, was to be out on the street corner. And by street corner, it means exactly what you think it means. She would become a horrible, loose woman, and she would lose her mind because she just couldn't handle it. I hope you find that that's kind of ridiculous. Now, again, 20 years, 100 years plus a year, as we're celebrating in 2020, the Indiana Women's Suffrage Centennial Organization. And toward the ending years, while women, when they were out in public, they always had hats. I always say you can't talk about women's suffrage unless you're wearing a really big hat. So these were some of the Hoosier women that were there before us in the real times. So as I researched and did earlier presentations on women's suffrage. And then as I talked about it during the Women's History Month colloquiums that we have at Indiana State University, as we developed things to support the march that we would have on Women's Equality Day, August 26th, one year I developed a series of little badges, the type that you would wear if you were going into a museum, a little bit of living history. And one of the other members of the steering committee brought that idea to us, and I thought that was great. So I was able to find a lot of information, but not as much as you might think if you're not used to researching. You might think that the early 20th and mid to late 19th century might be easy to find information, but it isn't always. For example, Terre Haute newspapers are not all on microfilm or digitized. And for women, a lot of them were known by their husband's name, or they might not have had a known date of birth. Usually there's a date of death that's known. And so it became kind of a challenge as I was developing these living history badges, because I thought it was more important, more meaningful if you could have a badge with a person's name on it. So you will see some of these badges as we go along through the presentation. And then if you're interested in seeing more of them, I have a page that I still maintain and will continue to maintain about women's suffrage history that has a lot more of these badges on the page where you can see them. And so here's the first two. Celeste Barnhill. Now, one of the things that happened in the very early days of the what became the suffrage movement is there were a fair number of Quakers, both women and men, that were involved, because Quakers had a very egalitarian approach to their society. And so this woman, who came from originally Ohio, was born 1864, lived a long time, so she got to see suffrage happen. A lot of the earlier people, the big names that people know, did not, like Susan B. Anthony didn't live to see it. Elizabeth Cady Stanton didn't live, and so on and so forth. So she became president of what was called the Indianapolis Council of Women, and she was also a member of the Franchise League and another interesting organization called the Legislative Council of Women. But one of the things I liked about her in researching her, I found a great quote. She said, "Quaker women took the initiative in the suffrage movement. They were used to speaking at meetings and very adept in the work of organization." So that was just a part of my early training and was not hard at all. And I thought, I don't think a lot of the early suffrage people would necessarily have thought of that. But of course, they all became very good at presenting their case, going on mammoth speaking tours by train, by horseback, by carriage, and then, of course, in the later years, by car, including some rather famous cross-country treks to pick up support for women's suffrage, including one that's in a children's book about two women and a kitten, and a real story about their traveling from New York to California. One of the other people that I found, and probably the most interesting person, so we'll come back to her in a little bit, is a person named Helen Gauger. And she is based in Lafayette. She was not just a suffragist. Many people came from the temperance movement or the abolitionist movement, or in some cases both. Helen had to be one of the most energetic people I've ever heard of in my life. She maintained a strong relationship with the temperance or prohibition movement, as well as worked in both of the major national suffrage associations, the American Women's Suffrage Association and the North American Women's Suffrage Association. And she did some very much other interesting things. As they're so interesting, I will come back to her in a little bit. So where does the Amanda come from? friend my title. Amanda Way, the mother of Indiana suffrage. If you travel east on US 40 outside of Indianapolis, you'll come to a fairly small town, Dublin, and she also was raised a Quaker. And just a few years after the 1848 Seneca Falls meeting that is where we date the women's suffrage movement from, although there were some things going on before then. Just a few years later, when she was only 23, came up with a women's rights convention. And it was a 2-day event in 1851. Excuse me again. Naturally, I start to speak and then I get a frog in my throat. Hang on just a second. I had hoped to be able to find a perhaps less stern photo of her, but again, on like today when I have 16,000 photos sitting in my photo file, many people only had 1 or 2 photos at best taken in their lives. As I said, it was hard to find those. So Amanda Way over there on the other side of the state. Now, some of the suffrage workers that I'm going to talk about were pretty much based in Indiana, but some of them extended well out into the national movement. And one of the ones that I found, and someone who again did pass through the women's suffrage, so she got to see the end of the struggles, is Mary Harriet Gay. Mary Garrett Hay. So she was born in 1857, and she was very active for a number of years in the state of Indiana, but there were reasons for her to leave the state and move to New York City and move into the New York was very big on suffrage. That's where Susan B. Anthony lived, Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So there was a lot going on in the state. And she became Carrie Chapman Catt, the last president of Nassau, became her right-hand person. And one of the most fascinating pieces of information about her was that she and Carrie Chapman Catt are buried side by side together. And what it says on their tombstone is, "Here lie two, united in friendship for 38 years through constant service to a great cause." So she's definitely a person that you might want to find some more information about. In some cases, people have written biographies about these individuals, or they appear in chapters in books. And in some, if you're interested in historical research, there's a lot of work that could still be done in this area. Now, another person who has a permanent tie to this day to Indiana is May Wright Sewell. She died a month before the 19th Amendment was ratified. I feel that that was such a sad thing to discover. So she was working in Indiana. She did several things of an educational nature, including founding the Girls Classical School in Indianapolis. And in 1883, the state legislature did some, I'm going to call them tricky things, when it came to trying to get women's suffrage into the state constitution. Very tricky things. And I think she just kind of got disgusted and decided that it was time to go someplace else and see what she could do. So she did some things like founding the Indianapolis Equal Suffrage Association, but then she went and moved on. Her tie to this day is the May Wright Sewell is the Propylaeum, which is an organization and a Victorian home in Indianapolis. And there are awards given in her name every year. It's an organization that you can belong to. American Association of University Women was going to have its 2020 celebration there because of women's suffrage. And of course, that all fell apart. So again, May Wright Sewell, very interesting. So where does the Zerelda come from? Well, here she is, Zerelda Wallace. She came from a very strong temperance background, and she's kind of an example of someone who is very motivated, very interested, but because of the reception she got from the legislature, she got pissed off and became a very strong women's suffrage mover and shaker. So she helped form the Equal Suffrage Society and in 1978, and she became president of that for a while. And she went so far in just a couple of years later in 1880, she was at the United States Senate testifying in front of the Judiciary Committee on Women's Right to Vote. She did move in political circles. Her husband, David, was a governor of Indiana for a while, and she's the stepson, those of you with a literary bent, she's the stepson of General Lew Wallace, general from the Confederate War, but the author of Ben-Hur. And so he and his society resides in Crawfordsville. Her quote that I was able to find, "It is not the woman question that brings us before you today, it is the human question." This is from her testifying in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee. "You have attempted to do an impossible thing, to represent the whole by one half. And because we are the other half, we ask you to recognize our rights as citizens of this republic." So let's go back to Helen Gauger a little bit. Maybe I feel an affinity for her because she was originally from Michigan, as am I. Again, very much in temperance, which was around a little bit before suffrage and continued into the Prohibition era. I see a very strong, determined woman here, but I've also read a 1985 biography that was written by a newspaper man in Lafayette. She had a husband who was an attorney with very poor eyesight. So in order for him to be a successful lawyer, and he was a successful lawyer, she had to read all of his court cases. She had to look up everything in the legal books of the day. So she became very knowledgeable about the law, which came in handy later on. So she also became one of the most popular lecturers on the lecture circuit. This was a big deal in the 19th century. People like her that would become known locally would then be signed on to one of many talking circuits. She might be just on a speaking circuit, but she might also be speaking for temperance on a temperance circuit. She may be speaking about women's suffrage on a suffrage circuit. Just to give you an example, in 1887, in 5 weeks, just in the Midwest, she did 64 lectures. So she became very well known in the local area. And she also irritated a lot of people. And I don't think she really cared too much. So she married her husband in 1863, which was a very interesting time to be in Lafayette because it was just before they broke ground to start building what we know as Purdue University. So Lafayette was growing, there was a lot of activity, and she started writing a newspaper column. She did teach for a while. She had an educational background, and she had to sue a few people along the way. So in the 1880s, as she's been very public for a while, there was a group of people who decided to show her, to teach her a lesson. And they basically came onto her and her husband's property and demonstrated against her in a very tacky way, including cartoons and pictures on sheets. Well, one of the people in that group that came to teach Helen election was the police chief. So she sued him in 1883. She sued him for slander. And she won. She was awarded $5,000 in damages, although, as far as anybody can tell, they never actually paid her. But by this time, she was very big in suffrage, and she traveled to Kansas numerous times to try and help them through their various campaigns. In some cases, to try to get women to vote in municipal suffrage municipal elections, not necessarily full state elections. And she again was traveling a lot. There was another occasion where in 1893 she sued a US congressman and a newspaper out in Massachusetts for libel. So she's already had a full busy life. And in 1894, she tried to vote. She was not allowed to vote, so she sued the election board. In order to present herself in court, she asked and was admitted as the first female member of the Tippecanoe County Bar. The same day she was admitted to the Tippecanoe County Bar, she delivered her argument, Gauger v. Timberlake et al., a 4-hour argument. And then when she was done with that, she took the transcripts of her argument, and it was published in 1897 as a booklet called The Constitutional Rights of the Women in Indiana. She lost her case. She lost the appeal. And then, sadly, in 1907, she died. Simply amazing person. Now, I have 2 pictures of her. This one where she's fairly young and determined, and this one when in the latter years, in the 1890s. Now, we all age. But I think in this case, knowing those little bits and pieces, and that's just some of Helen's story, to me, this is saying, if I have to sue somebody one more time, I will. Do not mess with me. And I think a lot of people did not mess with her. Now, on a slightly more calm note, some of the other things that were going on. This is a picture that, and I'll come to, this is a local, an Indiana State normal lecturer. And she was one of the members of a group I'll talk about in a moment. In 1872, the Indianapolis Suffrage Society was formed. And then in 1915, there were other things going on, but there was kind of a lull in the suffrage movement in Indiana. It kind of picked that speed back up in the early 1900s. And in 1915, there was the Indianapolis Women's Suffrage League that had over 1,000 members. So there were things going on all of the time, but a little bit of a lull. Now, you probably can't read this very clearly, but I wanted to show you some of the things that were being used to promote suffrage for women. This is called Votes for Women. It has people say, we say, and I will read a couple of those in just a moment. But if you can notice down at the bottom, it says that it was produced by the Women's Franchise League of Indiana. And these were actually flyers that were produced by the national associations. There were first 2, and then they merged, and then they would come into the state, and then the state would personalize them to their local state and read them. So this again was very common. So let me read you a couple of the people say, we say. The people say the majority of women don't want to vote. We say the majority never wants progress. Women will not vote when they are given the right. We say official figures show women do vote largely where they have the right. And what you might not know is that before the 19th Amendment was ratified, women in 20 states could vote for some candidates, but not full voting privileges. So that's what they're referring to there. Women have enough to do without voting. We say voting takes but a few minutes, and that can be done on the way to the market. Some of these do not translate well to modern sensitivities, but I'm going to read a couple of them. It would double the foreign vote. We say there are in the United States over 12 times as many native-born as foreign-born. And of course, that was part of the critiques of the major suffrage movement, is that it was primarily a middle class to upper class white woman's movement, although there were other people involved. And last, women are represented by men. We say, would men let women represent them at the polls? Does a man with women to represent have more than one vote? Or does he cast his vote according to the majority vote of those he represents? No, then he doesn't represent them, and so on. And one more of these flyers. This one I like because, again, why Indiana women should vote. And you can see at the top, this should be obvious, but it was not. Women should vote for the same reason that men do. And then they broke it down into three things: taxation, citizenship, and legislation. So under citizenship, it says that Abraham Lincoln defined an ideal republic as, quote, a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But ours is a government of the people, by half the people. A voteless person is not a citizen. And then in legislation, they listed some of the things that women were specifically interested in. In some cases, they were issues that might be considered women's issues, but really are issues for everyone. This included Indiana women are concerned in the development of public schools. They are concerned in such matters as clean streets, public sanitation, and pure food. That was a big deal in those days. They are concerned about the housing of the poor and the elimination of the slums. How are we doing with that? They are concerned about the conditions of working women, their hours of labor, wages, and sanitary surroundings. And in a parenthetic note, they say there are considerably more than 100,000 self-supporting women in the state. They are concerned about the condition of working children. And this was before a lot of child labor laws were passed. And in parentheses, there are more than 5,000 working children in the state. And they are concerned in the solution of moral questions like temperance and the social evil. Do you know what the social evil is? Can you guess? You can put what you think it might be in the chat. We'll come to that in a little bit. When we break for the song, we take a little song break. We'll see if there are any questions or issues there. Okay, so groups of people for suffrage. Here's a couple of examples. On the left, we have Auburn in sort of a military, naval-esque marching band, white, very common to wear. But the one in Fort Wayne I like because it is a group of young people, men and women, and it's not a very clear picture, but I think it might be possible that there is one or two African American people in there. I wouldn't swear to it, but again, it's not a good picture. Well, let's come back to Indiana State normal as it was then. And let me tell you something. On Friday noon, December 5th, 1913, was organized the largest and most democratic body in the state normal school, the Equal Suffrage League of the Indiana State Normal School. The league includes both men and women of the student body, and of the faculty, and has a charter membership of over 200 to begin its work. 4/5 of the faculty have signed its constitution. The purpose of the organization, as set forth in the Constitution, is, quote, the dissipation of the ignorance and indifference which exists with regard to the equal suffrage movement. And the president, which I found was very interesting, what came from not an Indiana town, but came from Granola, Oklahoma. So I wonder if she had some kind of an Indiana connection. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to find out any information about her. So in the Indiana State Normal Yearbook, which they were huge, they were like 300 pages long, there were pictures of the group, and that was the Rose Cox that we saw a little earlier was one of them. So there were a number of postings in the 1913 yearbook, and there was a little bit of information in the 1914 yearbook. It said the Equal Suffrage League is to start this year with a large, enthusiastic membership. They distributed $3 worth of buttons. They're not doing a lot of social functions, but they're doing propaganda and enlightenment. And they have Miss Barber. She went back to Granola, and so on and so forth. And the end of that says, come, cease idling, take your share of responsibility in the world's work. Unfortunately, after 1914, there isn't a single mention of those folks. So we don't know what happened. We might be able to track down someplace, but that's primary documents research. That's digging around in print archives and seeing what you can find. So since I am based in Terre Haute, I will talk to you about a couple of people from Terre Haute. One here, Bertha Coakley, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, the main suffrage movement was kind of anti-minority and sometimes rabidly so. But we actually had a woman here in Terre Haute who was a member of that Equal Suffrage League of Indiana, and she was an educator. We have a local researcher working on issues of African American women's history and just history in general. She hasn't really been able to find out much more about her. And then going back to continuing with Terre Haute, Lillian White. I like this photo because to me, if I saw this photo and didn't know anything about her, I would go, well, she looks like a nice, quiet, older person. You know, probably stays at home. I mean, I'm sorry, I was just, making judgment calls on her appearance. Well, she lived on the same street I live on in Terre Haute, president of the Terre Haute Franchise League, president of the League of Women Voters, first woman to serve on a jury and foreperson in Vigo County, first woman member of the school board and park board. So, what is it? Quiet waters run deep, I think is the term. So never judge a person by their initial appearance. And again, she lived from through the women's suffrage movement and far on into the 20th century. Now, one of the people that is near and dear to my heart, I hope you know about Eugene Debs, grew up in Terre Haute, went from being a Democrat to being a leader of the American Socialist Party, ran for president 5 times, and we have his wife, Kate. Both of them were pro-suffrage. The Socialist Party was very pro-suffrage. And hang on, excuse me, just. So here we have Kate Debs, again, another sort of determined woman in her younger years, although she and Debs by this time had been married for a while. A picture of her and Debs a little older. They were very big on speaking. Debs was a big speaker. A lot of people assumed that Kate was sort of more staying at home, and some of Debs's early biographers kind of talked to her about kind of not really in favor of what Debs was doing, but that's proven to not be true. Well, while Debs was very much known as a powerful, charismatic orator, Kate kind of stood her own as well. So I have a quote here from Debs in 1903, again, just one of many where he talks about women. And of course, he's very interested in the woman worker. And the common phrase he used would be the wage slave, because, the working and not for not very good wages and so on. So he says, someday we shall develop the social passion for womanhood. And then the gross will disappear in service and justice and companionship. Then we shall lift woman from the mire where our fists have struck her and set her by our side as our comrade and equal, and that will be love indeed. Well, Kate wrote a column in the Terre Haute Post in 1910, and I want to read you a little bit from that post. It was actually a newspaper, an opinion column in response to a woman who wrote something negative about women's suffrage. That was Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish. How's that for a name? Stuyvesant Fish was a person who was president of the Illinois Central Railroad, and his wife, Mamie, was a socialite and a self-styled, quote, fun maker of the Gilded Age. But apparently something set her off about women's suffrage, and Kate chose to respond to her. So let me read just a little bit about Kate, and I think you'll see that she's a pretty good orator herself. Again, she didn't go out and speak like Debs did, but her husband did. If woman is less than a human being, less than a citizen, a mental weakling, requiring man as a guardian, if she is but the property, appendage, and convenience of her lord and master, then I submit she ought not to have the right to vote, but should in all meekness resign herself to her divinely appointed lot, the echo of her husband, the servant of her sovereign, satisfied to spend all the days of her life in the realm of mental inferiority and political non-existent. So down toward the end, she says, it is particularly in the name of the 5 millions of wage-working women in the United States that I raise my voice on behalf of unrestricted women's suffrage. These women have to go out in the world and compete with men in industry, in business, in educational and professional life, and why should they not have the same political rights and privileges? As a rule, they are the victims of the most unjust discrimination in respect to wages and treatment because they lack even the limited means of self-defense with which their male competitors are provided by the manhood suffrage. If the pampered pets of society do not want to vote, the working women do, and for reasons that no society queen, such as Mrs. Stuyvesant Fish, with all her brilliant sophistry, can successfully deny. I love it. Pampered pets of society. Isn't that a great phrase? Now, I am going to talk about a Terre Haute person who also went into the national sphere, Ida Husted Harper. It was in her formative years as a suffrage person when she was in Terre Haute. She was a journalist, which was fairly unique. She was an editor out of the local paper, and then she went on to New York. Well, tying things together, Eugene Debs brought Susan B. Anthony to Terre Haute in the 1870s. This is before he's a socialist. He's a local politician. And he walks her around town, and people are not happy, apparently, to have Susan B. Anthony in town. Well, they had the meeting, and Ida Husted Harper was in attendance. She got to know Susan B. Anthony. They started to correspond. And after a certain point, she moved to New York to Rochester, which is where Susan B. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton were based. And she became Susan B. Anthony's biographer. In addition to that, Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony had written 3 volumes of the history of women's suffrage, and which took them up to from 1883 to 1900. And then Elizabeth Cady Stanton died. So Susan B. and Ida wrote volume 4, and then Susan B. Anthony died. And so Ida wrote volumes 5 and volume 6. And if you look at some of the parade pictures of suffrage in New York City, you'll spot Ida Husted Harper very close. If Susan B. is marching, you'll see her very close to her and other major movers and shakers in the suffrage movement. She was also an author of many publications, and just in one publication alone called the North American Review, she wrote a number of articles, most of them, but not all of them, about suffrage. In April 1906, she wrote about Susan B. Anthony, who had just died. But one article I noticed talked about the life and work of Clara Barton. I thought, why is she writing about Clara Barton? Now, if you were in the room, I would say you all know who Clara Barton is. And most of you would say yes, and most of you would say a nurse. She was also a suffragist. So I've started a list of people I don't know are suffragists. Famous people that you would know. And here's who I found so far besides Clara Barton. Helen Keller, big suffragist. Mary Pickford. Jane Addams, known as one of the major founders of social work. Louisa May Alcott. And Elizabeth Blackwell. So these again are things that have sort of bubbled up while I've been doing my main research. People that are known for many other things, not suffrage, but they were. So Ida's, as I said, became Susan B. Anthony's biographer. It's a 4-volume work, and is dedicated to Susan B. Anthony, who's given 50 years of noble endeavor for whom to her. So that was pretty much. And again, just to give you an idea of the level, the stature of nationwide that this woman, this journalist from Terre Haute garnered. This is her New York Times obituary. How many women generally would have a New York Times obituary? How many women from Indiana and from Terre Haute would have one? And not a short one. This is a lengthy New York Times obituary. So I just thought that was very interesting to find. And she wrote columns for the New York Times. She wrote letters to the editor for the New York Times. So again, very, very amazing woman. She is a woman that needs a historical marker. And we do not have a historical marker for her anywhere in the state. And while there might be a couple of other places that feel that they could have a historical marker, I want one in Terre Haute. And we just had a new historical marker last year for women's suffrage that's in the Irvington area of Indianapolis. It cost $3,000 to get a historical marker. So that is something that if you have someone locally like that, that you might want to have a historical marker, you should start researching it now. So this is an opportunity. We're going to switch over and have a brief song break. And so and this is going to be an easy one for you because it too is to the tune of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And let's check here. 1, 2, 3, 4 screens. So this will give you a chance to take a little Zoom break, kind of, and instead of just listening to me for a moment. So I want to hear you. We're from my house in Terre Haute. So let me get over back here. Hang on just a minute. Get back over here and share my screen. And find a note you like. And here we go. They saw it in the shadows of that old New England bay. They heard it in the breezes of that cold December day. They sent it with the echoes to Britannia far away. That truth was marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As truth comes marching on. The trumpet then was sounded that shall never call retreat. Adown the century softly we hear the tramp of feet. Today we still are marching to the same old music sweet of truth still marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. As truth comes marching on. We're here to swell the anthem that is heard across the sea, that equal rights and law and love is meant for you and me, where every law was founded on the plain of liberty, while truth came marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, as truth comes marching on. Our hearts have felt the glory of the coming of the time, when law and right and love and might shall make our land sublime, when mountain, hill, and rock and rill with freedom's light shall shine, as truth comes marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah, as truth comes marching on. Did you sing, Kathy? I will say, but before I switch back to the break today, I know you're mostly only seeing me from the top up, but I am wearing my women win the vote sash, which is a good thing there. With, of course, the 3 colors. And I love Kathy, who's also dressed up. Have a little Votes for Women pin here, and another one that's a recreation of the pin, the sorts of pins that people had. So I usually have more pins on, but that's all I went with today, because you have to dress up. All right, let me find my screen again. Okay, it really is very interesting to look for the images of the time that were put out to represent the suffrage movement. This is probably one of the most famous and really one of the most eloquent. And what it's saying to the nation is that women's suffrage started to be successful in the West. And if you can see a really clear picture of what's going on in the heartland and then further out east, you're seeing sort of a lot of women yearning to be able to vote. So 1848, we got started. Decade after decade, we tried to get various legislatures to sanction voting, either for all women in their state, or even better, a federal movement, federal amendment. Those are 2 kind of warring approaches. The people who wanted to do it state by state, the people who wanted to do it as a federal amendment to the Constitution. So when things really got going in the late teens, during the First World War, between January 1918 and June 1919, that's when they finally voted, the House and Senate voted on the federal amendment 5 times. And the biggest group of people fighting against it, defeating it each time, were the Southern Democrats. Primarily because if women got the vote, then African Americans and men and African American women would want the vote, and other minorities. And unfortunately, that was very much the attitude of the time. President Wilson was very much against women's suffrage. But then he, through a sequence of events, he decided that he would favor it. So he finally called a special session of Congress in May of 1919. And then on May 21st, 1919, it passed the House 304 to 89. And then June 4th, it came to the Senate. The Southern Democrats abandoned a filibuster. You know, we're still talking about filibusters right now. 37 Republican senators joined 19 Democrats to pass the amendment. And keep in mind, in those days, the Republican Party was the more progressive, and the Democratic Party was the more conservative. It's hard to believe that, but we've got the current images sort of locked into place. So we're moving towards the federal amendment. Meanwhile, another unique thing happened in Indiana between 1914 and 1917. Women from the 8 organizations that you see here from the Indiana Federation of Clubs, and clubs were big. Wow, were they big. And you can see like the Association of Collegiate Alumni, that's what eventually became AAUW. And of course, the Indiana Equal Suffrage League, they all came together to form a coalition. Isn't that fantastic? A coalition of women. They represented 80,000 women throughout the state. For a while, a Mrs. Stimson from Terre Haute was chair, and another woman, a Mrs. Sarah Stern of Terre Haute, was chair of the finance committee. So there's a lot of power going on in Terre Haute there. So they formed to present issues to the legislators. But here's the really hooty part. So that was amazing. But here's the hooty part. They went to Governor Ralston and they said, we have formed a group called the Legislative Council of Indiana Women, and we would like a room in the State House so we can have an easy way to get out and talk to all of the legislators. And Governor Ralston said, sure. Now, obviously, I'm simplifying it a lot, but that's what he did. And that room that they were given, it wasn't a big room, and there are some photos of it where the walls are covered with petitions. Back in 2020, in January, when we were celebrating when Indiana ratified, they put a historical plaque next to this room. I did not get to that room, so I don't know where it is. But if you go to the State House, you find the first person who works there and you say, where's the room that was the home of the Legislative Council of Indiana Women? I want to see the plaque, and see if they can take you to it. So they operated for quite a while. And of course, when they had the opportunity, they promoted suffrage, but that was not the only reason that they were there. Now, here is another unique part of the history of suffrage in Indiana. Two representatives, the Master-McKinley Partial Suffrage Act. Partial suffrage. That's what was plaguing a lot of states. Women might be able to vote for president, or they might be able to vote for state legislators, but not United States legislators, or they might be able to vote in cities. It was ridiculous. Well, the Massey-McKinley Partial Suffrage Act gave them the right. This came through in February of 1917. It granted women in the state to vote for municipal elections, school elections, special elections. And this flyer came out after that to get women to vote, right? Now, notice the date, if you can see it. It says you must register any weekday from June 20th to August 20th, which is my birthday. So February 1917, the partial suffrage vote passes. June 20th to August 20th, they need to register. Delegates will be elected September 18th. Well, what happened? It was ruled unconstitutional. Between those dates of June to August, just in Indianapolis alone, 30 to 40,000 women registered to vote. Declared unconstitutional. How happy do you think those women were? And how more ready than ever before do you think they were for full suffrage? So the Women's Franchise League went out, and they already had leagues around the state, but in less than 2 years, they had 200 more leagues. Sometimes people just don't know what the ramification is of what they think is something that's going to prevent something there. Well, so meanwhile, where's all the suffrage? Where is all the women's suffrage? Wyoming, 1869, that's the first. Colorado, Utah, Idaho. Then things got very quiet. Then Washington. California was a big, again, sometimes this was several elections, right? Remember the list I started with? Oregon, Arizona, Kansas, all of these in 1912. Illinois, 1913. So this is tied, of course, to electoral college votes. But this map is one of my second favorites because it's a little hard to see. So the yellow states, full suffrage. The shaded states, women could vote on taxation, bonds, school suffrage. There's a few dotted states. Well, actually, there's one dotted state, which is in Illinois. They could vote on municipal, presidential, partial county, and state suffrage. And then all those dark blue states, they couldn't vote yet. Think what a mess that was. Think how many. So you had to have different ballots, right, for men and women. It's just such a mess. I don't know what they were thinking. Back to the women in hats. This is a 1919 group. I am reasonably sure the woman on the far right in the plain hat and glasses is Helen Benbridge from Terre Haute, who was president of the Franchise League when the vote occurred. When the vote occurred in Indiana, it's ratified in June in the federal legislators. And of course, immediately people, women in all of the states were trying to get their state legislators to vote. A lot of states didn't even have a legislature meeting in 1919. We're still in 1919. So governors had to agree to call special sessions. Some did, some didn't. Suffrage didn't always pass when they did. Well, Governor Goodrich, hemmed and hawed for a while, and I find that very interesting because his wife was a suffragist. So I'm imagining every night after June, she would be going, and when are you going to call the special session? Well, he finally said he'd call it. He said he'd call it on December 31st, and then he said, I'll do a one-day session. That's all you get. And that was on January 16th. So when Indiana voted for suffrage, the Senate voted 43-3, and the House was unanimous at 93. There were 300 women in the hallway. If you've ever been to the State House, it's of course the hallway outside of the chamber. There were 300 people there. There was a band playing Glory Hallelujah. And we finally had suffrage. And here's a picture of the Indianapolis Star the day after. If you go out and look for other articles, photographs of governors signing suffrage, you'll always have the man surrounded by the women in the hats. Now, again, he wasn't particularly in favor of it, but he said a little bit in the speech that the governor made. He said, your presence bespeaks not only a high purpose to recognize the political equality of the women of the nation, but also a patriotic instinct to pay tribute to them for their valiant services and ceaseless devotion in the great crisis through which we have just passed, which was World War I. So he made a nice little speech there. And we have another picture on the left of Governor Goodrich signing. And just to show you that I was serious about the women in the hats being near, the person on the right, that's Governor Roberts in Tennessee. That was the final signature for ratification to make it a law, to make it the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. So the first three states, and they all claim to be the first, but the first three states to ratify were Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So all regional Midwestern states, they all ratified on June 10th. What I haven't been able to track down yet is, okay, you're all claiming to be the first. So what time did your legislature actually do the ratification? And then we move down through the list to Indiana, which was the 26th state to ratify. And then they only needed 10 more. And so Indiana ratified June 16th, 1920. Tennessee, this is the big one. There's a whole book about the Tennessee final days, August 18th, 1920. But then it was the signature of the governor was shot on a train and up to Washington, D.C. And one thing about the groups of people watching the governor sign, because it's historic, the Secretary of State made sure that nobody was in the room on purpose, I don't know why, when he signed it into law. I think he was just thought he was being funny. The items I mentioned that there were people who could vote, but not all the same way. So it's ratified in August. A lot of people had to scramble around the United States to get the women registered, to get the ballots, to get the voting stations. And Indiana did manage to do that. But the only state that kept track of statistics by gender was Illinois. So we really don't know how many women voted. I mean, we can kind of extrapolate that, but they're really not sure. So we were the 26th state, several years, 12 years after the 19th Amendment. We had Virginia Jenks elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. And this number might be a little bit out of date. I'm not sure. 2 women and Hoosier women currently in the House. So it took the United States 72 years to achieve full suffrage for women, full voting access. It took Indiana 69. So, as I mentioned, we in Terre Haute have been doing a march. We did a march from 2012 through 2020, although it was a virtual march, and then we've stopped our operations there. But we always had between 200 and 300 people come, and we had programs and speeches, and then we would march a short distance. So it was a really, really great way to celebrate that. I have a couple of credits here for all of the help I had over the years putting the research together, using the resources. My dean, Robin Crumrin, Cunningham Memorial Library. I first started doing presentations on women's suffrage for women's studies at ISU, which became gender studies, which is now one of the programs inside multidisciplinary studies. So that was always a great opportunity to do that. Again, I continue to be, until we run out of the grant money, the Indiana Humanities Speakers Bureau, that's great. While I was working with the League of Women Voters of Vigo County, Carolyn Collicott was president through all of that. Krista Mickle Reynolds is a local historical researcher. Katie Kennedy, which was a student at ISU last year, and she designed our buttons. We had buttons each year for the march, and you might have seen some of them in the PowerPoints as we went by. And again, the Women's Equality Day Steering Committee from 2012 to 2020. So if you roam around the state, you can look up where the historical markers are. I hope you know where that is. It's on the state government site. But I was able to go over to where the first Women's Rights Convention was. The one on the right is actually in what's now a National Historic Site in Washington, D.C. That is one of the original banners that the Silent Sentinels stood with outside the White House day after day. So that was very exciting to be able to visit that. If you aren't aware already, a book that was published especially for last year's centennial about the women's suffrage movement in Indiana, it's called We Must Be Fearless. And it's by Anita Morgan, who is an IUPUI professor who is continuing her research, concentrating on the African American suffrage experience. Also, just before everything happened in March last year, I was able to see a great two-person play in Indianapolis at the Phoenix Theater called The Agitators. It was Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass, who were lifelong friends, except for a little while after the Civil War, when they kind of got into, let's call it a disagreement about the 14th and 15th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. It was very nicely done. I hope they bring it back because, of course, they had to close down after several performances, just as everything was closing down. I mentioned there's a whole book about the Tennessee final suffrage vote ratification. It's called The Woman's Hour, but I love the fact that the author of that has come out with a younger reader's version of that book, because women's suffrage, the right to vote, that's not necessarily something that comes automatically in the school system. Women's history tends to be neglected. I was able to write 4 articles for a local magazine called Terre Haute Living, and one of those articles was a bibliography of the children's books that I had found while I was doing my research. And if we were together today, those books would be on display. A lot of libraries, of course, have been buying books very heavily in the last couple of years about women's suffrage, both for adults and for children. But if anybody is interested in that bibliography, you're welcome to contact me. And then late last year, we had a book called Vanguard, the first book in over 20 years to talk about specifically the Black woman vote. It's a very good read by Martha Jones, subtitle, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. And there are some other books that have been coming out since then. And last but not least, if you are interested in how we virtually celebrated the 100 years of women's rights to vote, I maintain the Facebook page. It's Women's Day March TH Terre Haute, and we did record that, and you can see what we did and what we talked about. It was a really pretty good event as we put off of that. So that takes us back around to Amanda, to Zerelda, and that is the end of my presentation.
Okay, that was great. I don't care how many programs, presentations, conferences, webinars, you know, I always learn something new, you know, especially over the last year. A lot of them programs focused on suffrage, and you know, there's always another woman's story to tell. And in case you were wondering, I didn't check all of the books, but I do know that the library does have the Woman's Hour to check out, including in the large print edition and the young readers version.
That one book about Tennessee, it needs to be like a mini series. Don't try to squeeze it in, because it needs to be, I'd say, at least 3 episodes.
Yeah. We do have a copy of We Must Be Fearless, but right now it's only reference, and it lives on the shelves in the genealogy library if you want to come check it out. Not literally, but maybe we'll get some for checkout here soon.
Do I have a couple of minutes to tell you a couple of quick anecdotes about the vote of November 1920?
Sure.
Okay. Three quick anecdotes. Election day, the African American area of Indianapolis was awakened at 4 a.m. with cannon fire to make sure they were up and ready to vote at 6 a.m. One woman who was over 100 years old, down in southern Indiana, had one of the big things that divided the election that year was President Wilson's push for the League of Nations. And she had registered, she registered Republican and was prepared to go and vote Republican. But at the last minute, let me check that. I don't want to get the, she basically changed her vote. Yeah. So in Washington, Indiana, she was 103. Her name was Sarah Cannon. She voted early. Her sister took her down, or her daughter took her down. She had poor eyesight. She had registered as a Republican, but she believed in the League of Nations, so she voted straight Democratic. And the last one was a woman in Indianapolis. She was driving to the polls by herself. She was hit and overturned her car. She was badly bruised and shaken. It did not hinder her from casting her first vote. She, quote, "I was worried for a while because I thought I would not be able to vote, but after I was brought home in an ambulance, I rested several hours and then went to the polls. And that after she voted, she felt much better." By the way, those stories come from looking around through the Hoosier State Chronicles, which are digitized newspapers, and they're hard to deal with, and they're not always perfect to read, but you find all of these treasures and many, many more, all of these details. So thank you for letting me share those.
And thank you for joining us today. You know, I hope someday you'll actually make it down here and we can meet in person. I can't promise I'll be wearing a hat and sash, but
I was really looking forward to coming down, because I came down once for my birthday. We took a trip down to Corydon and stayed there for a while. So nice. I was really looking forward to getting back. I'll make it. When I retire, I'll have an RV and we'll just tootle on down. And
there you go.
Okay.
Let's check and see and make sure that there aren't any questions. Oh, looks like we're good.
Okay.
Thank you to everyone else who was able to join us. If you missed out on anything, we did record it, so we'll be posting information on how to access that later. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.